Welcome to the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. We continue our hybrid delivery of events this evening as we live stream our guest speaker's presentation here in front of a small but enthusiastic group at the AIIA National Conference Centre in Canberra. We're delighted that Dave Sharma, the federal member for Wentworth, has agreed once more to address the branch. His last talk here a few years ago during his posting in Tel Aviv covered Australian policy in Israel. But tonight, Dave will reflect on fundamental questions about Australia's capacity to influence an increasingly unpredictable, if not bizarre, international environment. We're looking forward to him taking up where he left off in his recent provocative interpreter essay on some of the shortcomings of Australian diplomacy. Dave's own diplomatic career can only be described as rich. He joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 1999 and was posted to Port Moresby and later to Washington, where he established close links with US political and strategic policy leaders. In Canberra, he advised both the Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, managed Australia's diplomatic presence in Africa, and directed what was then the Indonesia desk. From 2013 to 2017, Dave served as Australia's ambassador to Israel during a very busy and productive phase of the bilateral relationship. When he came back to Australia, he entered politics and was elected to represent the Sydney seat of Wentworth in May 2019. And just to avoid getting bored up there on Capitol Hill these days, he chairs Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Treaties and the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee. Now, as per our normal routine, following Dave's talk, we will take questions from both our in-house audience and our online participants via the Q&A function on Zoom. We will aim to answer as many questions as time allows and finish at 7 p.m. Now, without any further ado, let me hand over to Dave to make his remarks.
Thank you so much, Heath, and thank you to the board of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and all of the guests who are here physically and also those of you who are here virtually. I first came to this building, this venue, I think in 1999, which was when I had my first year as a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade graduate trainee, and I've been racking my brains trying to think who the speaker was at the time, and I don't think your digital records go back that far, at least I couldn't discover them. But I've been here a number of times since, including most recently, as you said, Heath, when I was the ambassador to Israel and I was back here on midterms. But I think bodies such as this are incredibly important in promoting and informing a discussion of international affairs in Australia. Too often this topic is left as the sort of the domain of specialists and experts and happens behind closed doors. And I think, though, in Australia, it's increasingly becoming a mainstream topic of conversation as we're seeing how events beyond our shores impact our lives here. And I think bodies such as this and forums such as this are incredibly important in ensuring that a public debate is well informed and all the richer for it. I'm a big fan of an author called Robert Harris, and he's probably most famous for writing the Cicero trilogy, which tracks the life of Cicero from the sort of the high days of the Republic to the beginnings of empire. But he's recently written a book which I've been reading this week called The Second Sleep. And his book, The Second Sleep, opens in a scene and a setting that looks a lot like the Middle Ages. It's sort of a pastoral setting in England, where life is kind of predominantly rural and agrarian and time moves slowly. But as you get into the book, you realise that it's actually set 800 years into the future. And what's happened is that they're in the period of a dark age, which has followed a systemic collapse of civilization. And in this book, at least, the collapse of civilization happens in the year 2025, an event that our descendants 800 years hence refer to as the apocalypse. And the book is really piecing together, in a sort of an archaeological and historical sense, what was that age? These people these descendants of ours are living 800 years since, are trying to piece together what was it, what were the features of our civilization and what gave rise to its collapse. And what caused this collapse is never made particularly clear in the book, but it seems to be something to do with the result of a level of sophistication that society had reached, which rendered it uniquely vulnerable to external shocks. Now, I don't think we're heading for the apocalypse here. I don't think we're in the year 2025, but I think it's a useful reminder, this book and this anecdote, it's a reminder that historical periods and eras can come to an end, that empires and nations can dissolve, that world orders can terminate, that standards of living can deteriorate, that countries that were seemingly prosperous and successful can cease to become so. And as one of the characters in this book by Robert Harris, Second Sleep, writes, all civilizations consider themselves invulnerable. History warns us that none is. Now, today we are now basically 75 years, almost 75 years to the day, into what has been a single era, the post-war era. A lot has changed, grant you, in that time, in those 75 years, but the system of order which governs the world is remarkably the same. If you were transplanted from now back to 1945 or 1946, you'd recognise the world. And if you had a statesperson from that era come and live in this world today, yes, things would change, but the world order is basically the same. And 75 years is actually quite a long time in a historical sense for an era like this to be continuous. So when we talk, which I'm speaking this evening about, what does a post-COVID world look like, I think we always need to keep in mind what we are living through an inflection point. Is it something more profound? Is it just going to be a footnote? And that obviously informs the topic of tonight's debate, or discussion rather. How does Australia make its way in the post-COVID world? Now, if you look through the history of global pandemics, if you like, they may or may not have a strategic impact. Plague broke out in Athens in the second year of the Peloponnesian War, when they were actually close to within reach of victory over Sparta. It set them back considerably. They lost about a quarter of their people. They lost a lot of their armed forces and navy. Pericles, the great statesman, was killed in the plague, as were many others. And it's a blow from which Athens probably never recovered. The war went on for, of course, 30 years. Victory was ultimately with Sparta. But it can show you what sort of an impact the plague can have. The plague of Justinian crippled the Eastern Roman Empire when it washed through and helped give rise to the emergence of political Islam as a force and the Islamic empires that emerged off the back of the Byzantine Empire. The Black Death in Europe was a pretty profound social leveller. It strengthened the bargaining power of workers and helped accelerate the end of the feudal system, because workers were suddenly scarce and could command higher wages and could command better conditions. But then the last major pandemic that the world has experienced, the Spanish flu, didn't really have strategic consequences. It caused millions of deaths. But its enduring contribution to the world is probably the passport. That was an innovation that came about at the end of the Spanish flu. And it was the World War I, which in fact killed fewer people, but which immediately preceded it, which still leaves its imprint on the world that we live in today.
I found this on Wikipedia.
Oh my God.
Now, the world's ability to understand and treat COVID-19, the quality of our public health systems, our ability to gather and to share data and to learn and cooperate are obviously all orders of magnitude better than they were even a century ago in the Spanish time of the Spanish flu. But the world is also a much more interconnected place, and in many respects, the populations in our systems are somewhat less resilient than 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. Now, I didn't want to make any bold predictions tonight. I mean, punditry tends to traffic in bold and dramatic predictions. But I think we should all have the modesty to recognise that we simply don't know what we're living through right now. As dramatic as it seems and it feels to us, it might in the future just rank as a historical footnote, or it might be something which more profoundly alters the direction of the world and of humanity as well. And with that caveat that I think it's too soon to draw any early conclusions about the post-COVID world, I think you can sketch out a few trends which will affect the world that we occupy. Firstly, power relativities between nations will almost certainly change, and this will be a function of many things. It'll be how severe the economic impact is, how long high unemployment lingers, how well the systems of government and the country's leaders are seen to perform through this crisis, how much social and political unrest might result. And to state the obvious, those countries that manage the health impacts of the crisis well, that minimise the economic impacts, that keep public faith in their institutions and their structures, and that keep their internal cohesion as a society, well, it's these nations that will emerge, relatively speaking, the strongest from this. I think it's too early in Australia for any sort of triumphalism, but I'd say that where we are right now is that we're quite well positioned on any of these metrics. Some of our long-standing allies and friends are perhaps not as well positioned. I think the case numbers in the United States and in India are worrying, as is a seeming second wave or a resurgence of cases in parts of Europe as well. And some countries already fragile will come under severe internal stress depending on how badly this grips them. You're probably following, as I've been, these protests that are gripping Belarus against President Lukashenko there. And there's obviously a large number of factors at work there. He's ruled Lukashenko for a long time. It's a disputed election, of course. But I think part of the public revolt against him is his insouciant attitude towards the virus. Now, this is someone who, you might recall in the early days, refused to implement any public health restrictions in response to the pandemic. And he famously claimed that vodka and saunas would help keep the virus at bay. Imagine vodka and saunas, if only it were that simple to beat COVID-19. But Lukashenko's leadership, we don't know yet. It could be one of the first casualties, if you like, of the post-COVID era, and others may follow. Global shocks like this inevitably change the power order in the world, and often in unexpected ways, and this alters the pattern of strategic rivalry and competition. Now, the World Bank currently forecasts that the global economy will contract by about 5% in 2020, which would be the deepest recession the world has had since the Second World War. 5% is an average figure, though. This pain will be unevenly spread. It will hit hardest in countries where the pandemic has been most severe, but also those countries that are most exposed to things like international trade and international tourism. If you look across the world, the economies of the United Kingdom and Europe have contracted by about 20% year on year. The United States is around 10%. Some countries such as South Korea and Taiwan have experienced only a relatively modest contraction year on year. Australia is near the lower end of this. You would have seen in our quarterly accounts figures. We've contracted 6.3% on a year-on-year basis, 7% in the last quarter. And in China, which is one of the first countries to be gripped by this pandemic, their economy contracted about 7% in the first quarter, but it grew about 3 to 3.5% in the second. So it's too early, obviously, to make predictions, but it shows you there's a high degree of variability of the economic impact of this pandemic and health impact too, which we're seeing across the world. And much will depend upon the speed of the economic recovery in these countries, the depths of the challenge to their public health systems. But it will undoubtedly have some sort of effect on the power relativities. I think COVID has, to state the obvious as well, also accelerated the strategic rivalry or competition between Beijing and Washington, which is one of the big features of the world we live in today. I would say there is a heavily political overlay to that at the moment, with elections in Washington approaching. And I think it's a little too early to say whether this is a temporary or a more enduring phenomenon. I think we will really need to wait until November. But beyond changing the power relativities, I think there's another big trend that emerges from this. And I think we can see now through our rearview mirror that we've almost certainly passed the high water mark of globalisation. It might return again in 20 or 30 years, but I think we are now in a world that is retreating from globalisation. National governments and borders and the apparatus of the nation state have been the key tools in managing this crisis. International and tourism and travel has largely ground to a halt. Its recovery is likely to be slow. And publics have by and large turned to their national governments for support and protection during this crisis, rather than to supranational bodies or to multilateral institutions. Europe is a stellar example here. Europe is the region of the world that has gone furthest in creating supranational institutions through the European Union project. But it was really, in the early days of this crisis, every country for itself, as they threw up borders, as they hoarded medical stockpiles, and its post-national governance model was really nowhere to be seen. That's changed as the crisis has moved on, but I think it shows you that people still reflexively reach for their nation state as their first barrier of protection. Economically, I think we've seen businesses and nations being forced to examine the resilience of their supply chains. And I think whilst there have been some early wobbles and some scrambles and some shortages, you'd have to say that global supply chains have actually held up quite well on the whole. Generally speaking, there have not been critical shortages of goods really anywhere around the world. But that said, I think it's given people a bit of a shock, and I think diversity of supply and resilience of supply chains are really going to be watchwords going forward, and we can expect more onshoring of things that capabilities that people deem critical, particularly manufacturing, which will be driven both by commercial and national security imperatives, and probably less integrated global supply chains. Now, I think some of this is inevitable, and some of it might even be prudent, even for Australia. But I think the consequence of this is that free trade will come under pressure as a result, and protectionism will rise as a result. And I think the challenge is to ensure that this natural swing of the pendulum away from globalisation back towards the nation state does not lead to a full-scale resurgence of nationalism and dismantling of the rules-based international order, and particularly the non-discriminatory trading system, which has allowed countries like Australia to prosper so much in the post-war era. I think that's important because, to my mind, it's been growing global cooperation, economic integration, free trade and the multilateral system that have underpinned throughout the world really a period of unparalleled prosperity and peace for the last 75 years. And for a country like us, Australia, that has always been an immense beneficiary of an open order, that's always relied upon a system where goods and capital and people can move freely, that is particularly true. And a country like Australia, unlike others around the world, we simply don't have the size or the scale to go it alone, or to preach self-reliance, or to rely upon an internal market. And we need to make sure here that we resist any domestic pressures to do that. So I think some adjustments might be necessary there, but we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Finally, the final trend I'd sketch out here is that there's obviously a contest of narrative and legitimacy underway, and that's still in its early days. But this is the soft power contest, if you like, and that will too have a shape on the impact of the post-COVID world. The questions here are, which models of governance will emerge with their prestige most enhanced? Which countries will be seen to perform the best? Which systems will be the ones that offers the compelling model to emulate and to aspire to? And I think, is it authoritarian governments that have performed best? Is it liberal democracies here that have seemed to have handled this better? I think at this stage you'd have to say the record's very mixed. Some highly centralised systems of government have done this very well. Some highly decentralised liberal democracies have done this well. But it may be that there are trends that emerge in the future that kind of shift the equilibrium model or shift the norm for what states aspire to be as a result of this crisis. And I think equally importantly for the soft power contest, will some states earn the moral opprobrium of others, and so have weakened their claims to global leadership because of the way they've seemed to have handled this crisis. I think, to touch on the World Health Organisation here, the independent evaluation that the World Health Organisation is conducting, which, as you know, Australia argued strongly for, and which countries widely supported the World Health Assembly, is only just getting underway. And it's not an international tribunal. It's not designed to assign blame or assign guilt. Its purpose is to examine the origins and causes of COVID-19 with a view to ensuring the world is better prepared for pandemics. But undoubtedly, it will uncover some failings and identify some areas for improvement at the international level, but also, I expect, at the national level. We do need to ensure that it does so fairly and transparently, and no matter any sensitivities involved, because the stakes involved, which is really the global public health, the public health of the world's citizenry, are so high. I think when you think about this, if you draw a parallel to things like the regimes that we've got that govern nuclear, fissile material and chemical and biological weapons, we've spent decades as a world establishing and fine-tuning the machinery to control and regulate these things that are particularly dangerous material, nuclear and fissile material, chemical and biological weapons. But as we've seen through this crisis, biologically active material, in this case a new strain of coronavirus, can be just as threatening to global peace and stability. And so we need to make sure that we've got norms and mechanisms to ensure that the world can better manage and respond to the threat of a global pandemic in the future. Now, does Australia have what it takes in the post-COVID world? Well, I've spoken a little bit about what the post-COVID world looks like. To say it's uncertain, I think is a bit of a cop-out. The future is always uncertain, of course, when you see it from the president. It's only ever in hindsight that it all it's preordained. But I think we can say that the post-COVID world is a world where some countries emerge stronger and others emerge weaker, both in hard power terms and in soft power terms, where nations are likely to be more inward-looking and where globalisation is in some form of retreat, where competition between nation states is probably sharpened, and where the contest over narrative is one of the primary theatres of state competition, the information domain. And one where the multilateral and rules-based system takes a bit of a beating, but probably not a fatal one. I think in this sort of a world, Australia is as well placed as any country to manage it, to manage this post-COVID world. I think our economy has clearly taken a significant hit, as the national accounts yesterday show, but on a global scale, the size of our contraction has been on the smaller side. And importantly, in Australia, we've got the policies and the structural elements in place, a strong balance sheet and fiscal headroom, if you like, to support economic recovery and ensure that happens quickly. The health and the human impact of the crisis has been very limited in Australia. Obviously, every life lost here and impacted here is a tragedy, and it's regrettable, but generally speaking, the number of such tragedies in Australia is really orders of magnitude less than most other countries around the world. I think our institutions have performed strongly on the whole, and I'd suggest that public faith in Australia's institutions and public faith in the overall quality of our governance and our system, if you like, is probably the highest it's been in decades. This is, it's the federal government, it's the state government, it's the chief medical officers, it's our public health system, it's our epidemiologists, it's our frontline workers in hospitals, it's the contact and tracing systems, it's essential workers, people working in public procurement. I think on the whole, our systems have held up well. Yes, there have been some errors and mistakes on the way, and we should examine those, and we should be honest in seeing what the failings were there. But I think when you compare us around the globe, our systems have served us pretty well. And finally, I'd say our people, which is usually any nation's essential strength. Our people have proven resilient and adaptable, and social cohesion, the sense of unity and purpose of our people, has remained very high throughout this crisis. So I think we've got a long road ahead of us, no doubt, not least to ensure that the economy recovers and that unemployment is addressed and that people get back into work and that new businesses are built and new industries are built. But I think we should have the confidence that Australia will be as strong a nation in terms of our fundamentals emerging from this crisis as we were before. So that's Australia, but when we look out beyond our borders, I think the challenge for us will be to navigate what is becoming a more difficult world. Now, I said in my first speech to Parliament, used to be called a maiden speech, we call it a first speech to Parliament, which is all of 1 year ago, that our neighbourhood was becoming tougher, that our strategic holiday was over, and that we would need to mature into more of an actor and less of an observer or less of a bystander in international affairs. And I think COVID-19 has, to my mind at least, only emphasised and accelerated those sorts of shifts. In a post-COVID world in which strategic competition is sharpened, in which nationalism is on the rise, and in which the multilateral rules-based order, which has served Australia so well, is under challenge, Australia needs to be both more capable and more self-reliant in charting our own path forward. And I think that involves for us both hard and soft power. I think that's increasingly well recognised in the words of the Defence Strategic Update, which the Prime Minister launched just a month or so ago. Our region is in the midst of the most consequential strategic realignment since the Second World War. And the government is responding. The government's increasing defence capabilities, spending committing to about $270 billion over the next decade. Defence spending will remain, at 2% of GDP or more for the foreseeable future. And we're acquiring new capabilities which will enhance our ability to project power, safeguard our approaches and deter adversaries. And I think in response to a strategic environment that's deteriorated more rapidly than expected, and that will have been accelerated by COVID-19, it makes sense to increase in our ability to defend Australia and deter potential adversaries. But alongside this, alongside the defend and deter roles, there's another essential task for Australia, which is to seek to shape the environment around us, to minimise the risks, to maximise the opportunities, to work actively against the deterioration of the rules-based order, to actively shore up the rules-based order. And primarily, this is a task for diplomacy, this is a task for statecraft, this is a task for soft power tools. I noticed yesterday, Frances Adamson, I think in her speech at the AIIA, said that defence and diplomacy are two sides of the same coin, and I'm very much of that view. There's multiple ways of putting it when Clausewitz says war is the continuation of politics by other means. Well, diplomacy is effectively the prosecution of war by peaceful means. It's all spectrums of a single state struggle, if you like. Now, for Australia, we value an open order, one that's free from coercion, that's free from hegemony, where nations are sovereign, where borders are inviolable and where interaction can take place on the basis of predictable rules and norms. That's what we support. We oppose a hierarchical order structured by power where might is right, if you like. And you'd have to say, though, that order, the hierarchical order structured around power where might is right, is really, must be remembered, the default system of world order for most of recorded history. And it's only really this post-war period where we've had something rather different and rather unique. You'd have to say, I think, that this order is under some threat, including from the actions of several of the major powers. And this is why I think the task for Australian diplomacy is harder. We need to build new coalitions and new networks of cooperation to defend this order. I think some of these efforts to forge new coalitions are already underway. We've seen the Five Eyes configuration increasingly used, not just in an intelligence sphere, but for foreign ministers, for defence ministers, for finance and ministers or treasurers in the Australian parliaments to get together and coordinate policies. We've seen, I think, the relationships Australia has with some key partners thicken considerably, with India, with Japan, with Indonesia, with our step up in the Pacific. Even further afield, we're working very closely with countries in Europe in a way that we wouldn't have 5 or 6 years ago to help shape and support and shore up global norms. But I think just as our changed strategic circumstances will require our defence forces to achieve more, so too we're going to be asking more for our diplomatic forces, our diplomatic service. And we need to strengthen the arm of Australian diplomacy just as much as we strengthen the arm of the Australian military. Now, one part of strengthening that arm is resourcing. And, you know, I've been on the record about this. It is my view that we are one of the smallest diplomatic services for a country of our size and our interests, and certainly we have one of the smallest diplomatic footprints within the G20. And we do need to do better in terms of resourcing our foreign ministry. You know, in the last 2 decades, we've seen large growth in the budget areas of other parts of our national security apparatus, be it home affairs, be it defence, be it the intelligence agencies. But during that time, our diplomatic budget, really since I joined DFAT, 21 years ago, has basically remained static. I mean, today we spend upwards of $30 billion a year on defence, but only around $1 billion a year on diplomacy. And whenever you're looking at a national security budget, you want to make sure you've got a balanced effort. You want to make sure they're all working towards the same end. But obviously the marginal return you'll get on a dollar, when you're spending $1 billion, there's probably more that you're going to get on an extra dollar when you're spending $30 billion. So I think resources are part of it. But I think the other part of strengthening the arm of diplomacy is focus and effectiveness. And it's too often that this element is ignored in the simplistic call for just more resources for DFAT. When we look at defence, I think people these days forget that the condition precedent, the necessary condition, if you like, for the big scale up in defence funding was the first principles review. Now, this was a root and branch review that examined defence structures, its resourcing, its staffing, its effectiveness from the ground up. And it resulted in wholesale organisational changes to address what had become persistent weaknesses. And it was only when defence's structures and its culture and its internal resource allocation had been put on a sounder footing that the government had the confidence, if you like, to invest more money, knowing that it would be better spent and better managed. I think DFAT, frankly, needs to go through a similar exercise. I think there are some islands of excellence in DFAT, and I think they've shown themselves through this crisis. But my own personal view is that the whole is currently less than the sum of its parts. And there's still too much effort spent on legacy agendas and too many resources tied up in legacy structures. Finally, in a more contested information domain, this is the contest for narrative I spoke about, I think it's important that Australia speak with one voice and that this voice be heard. And the one voice part is why legislation was introduced in the Parliament this week to ensure that foreign agreements entered into by states and territories and other sub-federal institutions are put through a process to ensure that they're consistent with federal government settings. That's about speaking with one voice. But I think we also need to examine about whether our voice is being heard. And I think we need to look more closely at some of the means we have at our disposal to make our voice heard, from things like traditional broadcasting, but also from newer tools like digital platforms and other soft power tools to ensure that we're properly equipped for prevailing, if you like, in this contest for narrative that's coming up. So to turn to the question posed at the start of this speech, does Australia have what it takes in the post-COVID world? Well, I think we might only now be in the early stages of what could well be a multi-year crisis, and we don't yet know if its impact will be enduring or whether it will be less substantial, whether it will be an inflection point or whether it will just be a footnote. But I think in Australia, we should have good reason to be confident about our place in the post-COVID world. Undoubtedly, we'll be dealing with a more difficult and a more fractious world, but we should take comfort in the performance of our institutions and the resilience of our people today, and we should be confident about our ability to tackle the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure it'll bring out some questions both from here and our online audience. In a minute, I'll ask for questions from the floor, and when you have a question, please stand and identify yourself so that the question can be captured by our microphone here. While people are thinking about a question, I might get in with one first. You spoke about power relativities in flux. Of course, the big powers in our region, a resurgent China and our alliance relationship with the United States. How do you see Australia working in that environment as those important power relativities clearly change post-COVID and for the rest of the century?
Look, I think, obviously we've our important relationships in the region. I mean, you never want to get too much into this business of ranking them, but you would say they were Japan, Korea, India, Indonesia, China, of course, as well, and then the Pacific. But these are really the regional powers that we do a lot with. I mean, I think I'm worried by a few things. I think Japan has managed this crisis very well, but Abe's departure will leave a big vacuum in Japan. He's been an unusually strong and an unusually stabilising leader for what is usually quite a fractious political system. Usually Japan's political system leads to a lot of internal instability, which means they tend to be quite inwardly focused as a nation. Under Abe, they've been able to really, I think, add some security ballast to the region and keep it stable. I think India under Modi has been a great partner for Australia and increasingly a net security contributor to the region. But the pandemic is obviously, still raging very much in India. They've got a phenomenal amount of cases. I think the second highest number of infections in the world, or possibly the first. And I think, obviously, given the density of that population and the limited capacity of their public health systems, there is a risk that India will be sort of significantly sidetracked, at least for the next few years, in dealing with that. I think, look, China, it's hard to say for sure, but China seems to be emerging from this crisis relatively well. Their economy is growing again, as I said, in their second quarter figures. They seem to have managed the health impacts of this crisis well and contained the outbreak, the provinces where it first emerged. And certainly a lot of the supply chains and global supply chains that run through China, got back to normal quite quickly. United States, I mean, I think we still need to wait to see a little there. I mean, the economic figures in the United States are not great. 10% contraction year on year, but it's quite a different geographical picture across each of the states. The pandemic is kind of at different points of advancement in different parts of the world, and so where they emerge at the end of this, I think it remains open. I mean, obviously they're an incredibly strong and resilient nation, and I can't see a situation where they're not still the single most powerful actor in the world at the end of this crisis. But often in international affairs, it's the relativities or the sense of momentum that matters as much as the absolutes.
All right, thank you. We do have a question. Bryce.
Hello.
Hello, Bryce.
My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I want to congratulate you on a brilliant speech. The coverage of the long durée at the beginning was great, but I really appreciated, I guess, what is perhaps a different take on where you've been reported, which is or what your recent comments have been, which is that DFAT effectively lacks the resources, and you've said that that actually DFAT needs to go through a sort of restructuring process. And you talked about legacy issues in DFAT that perhaps need to be reformed, and places where funding could be spent more efficiently. And I guess if I'm to sort of be a little bit provocative, I guess, My question would simply be, could you be more specific?
Sure. Look, of course, I'm happy to be. I guess I just sort of caveat it with some modesty. But I haven't worked in DFAT for I guess it's about 3 years now, which is not long, I know. But even so, although I spent my career there, I recognise that my experience is one particular experience, and it doesn't mirror everyone's else. But I'd say two things. If you look at the organisational chart of DFAT, it basically hasn't changed in 20 years. The sort of the integration with AIIA has been bolted on, and there's sort of the old AIIA divisions, there's the old DFAT divisions, and there's been some attempt to sort of merge them and put them together. But when I say sort of legacy structures, I think that's what I mean. They've kind of still got the same divisions with the same tasks and the same responsibilities they've always had. And when something new emerges, the tendency is you create a task force to deal with that. I'm sure they've got a COVID-19 task force. And I think you really want to, we do foreign policy white papers all the time, right? There's one in 2017. But it's great to say these are our priorities, which is what the foreign policy white paper does. But the next part of that is always, well, how do you resource your priorities, and how do you have that reflected in your organisational structures where your people are working, what their roles are, what their functional relationships are. And DFAT just hasn't done that in 20 years. Like even there's changes in sizes, but it's always tinkering. It's to make the efficiency dividend. It's to make the cuts in headcount needed. But it's kind of just where are the easiest places to take the hit. And no one has really sat down and said, if we were building a foreign ministry from the ground up for Australia, where it is today, and we've got this many people, where are we putting them? I think that's what I mean by sort of legacy structures. And I think part of that with it is legacy issues. I think that there are things that DFAT continues to do because it's always done, and things that AIIA used to do that DFAT now does because it's always been done. I don't think I have enough specifics of that. I mean, as I said, I can't pretend to be an expert, but I think this is something that a first principles review would identify, because rather than saying, well, we need to get this square peg to fit in this round hole, where do we shave off the corners? It'd be, well, how do we build a round peg? And I think that's fundamentally what would need to happen. And I think, to be honest, and look, I'm not part of the government, I'm speaking as a member of parliament here, but to be honest, that would be what you need to kind of give the confidence to the government to invest more, a government of any political persuasion.
I might take one more question from the floor before we turn to our online audience. Paul.
Paul Lindwall. I think I wanted to say firstly that your comment about the review of the causes and effects of coronavirus is something very important. It's exactly why aviation is so safe today. Yeah. The ATSB, the NTSB, they've investigated things, no blame culture, very important. But there's a lot of premise in the world at the moment that there'll be a development of a vaccine, and there's never been a development of the vaccine of coronavirus, and there's a lot of resources being spent on that. I thought we could spend a lot of resources on time travel. It doesn't mean we could achieve it. So what's plan B if there's never a vaccine for coronavirus?
Look, it's a very good question, Paul. Firstly, I did want to pick up on your first remark, because I think it's often an example I used early on in this, when there was this sort of people were aghast that Australia was calling for an international crisis. Like, well, look, if a plane crashes, we don't say, gee, that was a terrible tragedy, but we'll all get in the air again. People say, who's investigating this? Let's find the black box. What happened? Because we don't want this to happen again. And it's not, as I said, people aren't hauled off in chains and sent to the dock. We just actually want to know what happened so we can improve it again. This is exactly the same thing. The global health system crashed. How do we fix it? How do we prevent it from happening again? What can we learn from it? That's really what this independent evaluation is all about. Look, on the second question, I mean, I think I tend to share a degree of skepticism about whether we'll be able to, firstly, how quickly we can find a virus. Secondly, how effective it might be. Thirdly, what sort of side effects might be. Fourthly, how quickly can you scale up production and get it out? I mean, we've done a great job, humanity, in defeating things like, measles and almost, eradicating polio and things like that. These were, multi-year efforts, took a lot of time, took a lot of research, took a lot of resources. And even if we throw a lot at this, that doesn't necessarily mean we can get a vaccine. So I think, look, the only alternative to not having a vaccine is living with this, right? Which means, I guess, that behavioural adaptations that we've had to make and systemic adaptations have to become normalised or institutionalised or entrenched. I mean, I think, look, international travel is an interesting one, because I think, look, I don't think the world can continue to function as we know it unless we get international travel happening back again. And I think particularly for Australians, and look, I get a lot of, my constituency, my electorate business, there's a huge amount of angst out there about people who can't get overseas to see family or friends or business opportunities or for significant occasions, or who can't get back to Australia. I mean, this is true across Australia. But how can we resume international travel when this is around? And I touched on the fact that the passport was really an innovation onto the back of the Spanish flu to provide some sort of certainty or surety about where people were coming from or where they're coming from an endemic area. And I think we'll need to have things like that in international travel. There'll need to be some sort of, testing and tracing and sort of protocol. They'll probably people might need to wear masks on flight, might need to remain more distant, or there might need to be some protocol that people have to quarantine when they're there or tested, or, wear some identifying, wear an anklet bracelet or something like that. But I think, and then look, the stuff we're doing now, I mean, we'll have to remain vigilant and we'll need to have a risk-based and a proportionate approach where the disease does not seem to be prevalent. People should be getting back to normal, but when it seems to emerge, adaptations will need to be made. Schools will need to be closed for a few days. People will need to be tested. Contact tracing will happen, and it might well be that these things that we're all struggling with now, for good reason, because they're quite new and novel, and they're not what we're used to. It might be that we have to institutionalise those. I'd love to think that we'll get a vaccine soon and it'll all be over and we can get back to normal. But I think that's not a plan, that's a hope. And what we've got right now is the plan.
Thanks, Dave. We might take a couple of questions from our online audience. Melissa Conley-Tyler, Bryce's predecessor, is asking about the introduction today in Parliament of the Foreign Relations Bill. And Melissa says this will give the Minister for Foreign Affairs the power to cancel international arrangements by councils, state governments and universities. Can you give concrete examples of the problems that could be had by that bill?
So Melissa wants me to argue against the bill?
Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the bill.
Yeah, sure. No, of course. Look, it is, so it's legislation that basically, to my mind, it codifies and clarifies the external relations power, which properly belongs to the federal government under our constitution. Look, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, look, no state government would attempt to conclude a treaty level arrangement, because I think even they would know that they lack the capacity in international affairs to do that, and their counterpart would probably not try and conduct a treaty level agreement with them. But, there are a large number of actors these days in the international system, and including in the Australian system. And generally speaking, international engagement is a good thing. We encourage it. This isn't about trying to discourage state governments from, conducting business deals and doing MOUs, nor is it about trying to stop universities from doing it, or councils, concluding sister city relationships, whatever they might be. It's just making sure that nothing that happens is too at odds with Australian foreign policy. Now, I think I don't want to get in the business of saying, well, certain agreements that we've got now will fall foul. I think overwhelmingly, when we do a stock take and we look at everything, most of them will get a clean bill of health. I think there will be some that we look at most closely. Look, I think undoubtedly Victoria's Belt and Road Initiative Agreement is something that we look closely at. But there's a number of other things. I mean, I recall, a number of times in my earlier career, I worked in Alexander Downer's office. He was the foreign minister. And I'd have a high commissioner and ambassador come in to see us, or to see the minister with me there, with a huge amount of bellyache about something that was happening that a local council was doing. They were flying a flag that was not recognised in Australia as a nation group. Marrickville City Council was trying to boycott Israeli goods and support the Israeli BDS movement. And the ambassadors come in and they say, well, hang on, is this Australia's policy or not? What can you do about it? And it would create us a whole lot of angst as a federal government for no gain. I mean, I don't think there's anything to be had by sub-federal levels of government going off on their own tangents and pursuing different foreign policies. I mean, if a nation is nothing else, it's a single unit in international affairs which behaves with a single personality, a single voice. So I think, to me, this is really what this is about: codifying powers that already exist, and to be honest, giving us the legislative power to do what should have been happening anyway, which is, municipal and state governments deferring to federal government on issues like this.
All right, thanks. Tess Newton-Kane has asked about one area that you perhaps haven't spoken so much about tonight, and that's the Pacific. And she's asked...
Tess is very passionate about
that's
the Pacific.
Right. Indeed. And she's asking really whether the COVID situation is an opportunity with Australia's Pacific step up to not do something so much to the Pacific, but with the Pacific. What do you comment on that?
Look, I think, I guess I'd say I'd probably contest the premise of the question, that I'd argue that we already do stuff with the Pacific. I think certainly the government has invested a lot more effort in the relationships in the Pacific in the last few years, and that includes the personal relationships. And, inherent in all of that is listening more. If you have more interaction with people, you understand better what their priorities are, what their needs are, and what they want you to do. It doesn't mean we can always do everything together that they might ask of us, just as they won't necessarily always agree to do what we might ask of them. I mean, we're all sovereign and independent states. But I think, look, there is an opportunity. There's always an opportunity for us to be doing more in the Pacific. I think we have been quite good in the early stages of this crisis in supporting the Pacific. I must say, I mean, the countries of the Pacific have on the whole done a very good job themselves in managing this. They closed their borders early. They've been very vigilant in sort of guarding against the disease. They've been very protective of their publics. We've helped them with things like accessing testing equipment, accessing personal protective equipment, helping them with the epidemiology and the tracing regimes and things like that. But I think once we get beyond this sort of phase, these countries will need some help to rebuild, and particularly the ones that depend on international tourism. Fiji and Vanuatu in particular, their economies will take a significant hit. Papua New Guinea is having community transmission of COVID-19, so they might need more help with the health elements of it. So I do think we need to be prepared to help them in the wake of this crisis, recover their economies and recover their strengths as well.
Okay. We'll take one more and then come back to the floor. Claire Young asking, have we passed the high water mark in the role that rules play in the international order relative to power? Is that a premature judgment, maybe?
I think we're seeing, I think that's probably it's a judgment you could sort of say with 60% confidence or something. I think you could say that power is increasingly, look, power has always played a role in the settlement of international disputes, even in the rules-based order. It would be naive to assume otherwise, but the relative weighting, if it's given to power, has, I think, increased in recent years, and the relative weighting that goes to rules. I mean, we've seen this with some of the trading disputes, including which our close trading partner, the United States, has initiated, have not been run through, WTO mechanisms. In fact, the United States has been, to my mind, quite unhelpful in basically causing WTO dispute settlement mechanisms and dispute settlement body to kind of grind to a halt by not allowing the appointment of people to that. But we've also seen it in things like territorial claims and land reclamation activities. I mean, part of the, a large part of the peace that we've sort of preserved since the end of the Second World War has largely been the rule about the inviolability of international boundaries and the fact that you can't change them. And yes, that has happened, but it's been the sort of exception that proves the rules. Russia's annexation of Crimea, for instance, or its incursion into Georgia. But we're increasingly seeing, and look, I'd point here to China's activities in the South China Sea with land reclamation, but also its claims under the 9-dash line and whatnot, that we think are at odds with international law, but not just at odds with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, at odds with a more fundamental principle that, international boundaries are inviolable and you cannot expand your territory by force. And I think, obviously, if that rule, if that norm breaks down, that's really the most important linchpin for peace in the modern era. If that rule breaks down, and if it seemed that international boundaries are now subject to, negotiation or coercion or outright use of force, well, we're really back to, a pre-modern era, at least to sort of a 19th century and further back here. And I think that is really worrying, which is why, I mean, there's a number of norms and rules we need to uphold around the world at the moment. I mean, the prohibition against the use of nuclear weapons, the prohibition against the use of chemical and biological weapons, cyber attacks increasingly need to be put into that sort of category, but, and rules-based trading system. But I think the most fundamental one, the most important one is that one, because that is really the linchpiece of the modern piece.
Thank you. We've got a number of students of international relations with us both here tonight and also online from the group here from the ANU and also from the University of Canberra. And so we welcome any questions you may have. But if I might preempt one question that has come in from a student.
I want at least one question from
yes,
a student face.
That's right. Well, while they're thinking about it, I might just pass on a question from one of our online students asking about your reflections on careers and international relations. What are the sort of pathways that you reflect on as being good in that regard? Obviously, DFAT was one for you, but maybe you've got other views as well.
Yeah. I guess I'd say a couple of things. First, I think there's more opportunities for those sorts of a career these days than there was. I mean, there's more parts of the government that have an international aspect to them than there was previously. That's probably been to the detriment of DFAT in some respects, but it means that there's more opportunities. I mean, you can have a career in the federal public service in places like defence, in home affairs, in intelligence agencies, in DFAT, all will have quite a high international element and be engaged in the affairs of the world. But you can increasingly do it with multilateral, multinational corporations, if you like. I mean, increasingly some of these organisations, particularly the digital platforms, I mean, they have a presence around the world. They care about the policies and behaviours of their host governments and things like that, and they want to have influence over those, which is really, I mean, really what a diplomat is. I'd often describe my role as basically, as a diplomat, you're part lobbyist, you're part spokesperson, you're part think tank, and that really is sort of how you spend your time. The think tank part is kind of analysing, interpreting and saying what's going on in your country. The lobbyist part is you're trying to get outcomes for your client. Your client happens to be the government of Australia. You're trying to shape some policy or get something done. And the spokesperson is you're just sort of there articulating your view and representing it. So I think there's a lot more opportunities now than there were. I think I have a lot of people sort of come to see me and say, I'm thinking about a career in international affairs. Have you got any suggestions or tips? I mean, I think always just do what interests you, I think, and, that everything else will look after itself, your career. There's, in my experience anyway, there's always, you can have a tendency to overthink these things or to try and lay out plans too far in advance, and usually there's far too many factors that are beyond your control that you cannot influence or cannot have a say over. So I think just do work that interests you. If you don't, find your dream job out of university, I think persevere, because increasingly people are coming to these careers. Increasingly people are having more of a portfolio career rather than a career for life. I mean, I'm having a portfolio career, right? As a diplomat now, I'm a politician, but other people will increasingly do that. So I think even some people, graduate recruitment in DFAT is a very competitive process. There's a lot of bright, talented people who make excellent diplomats who, for whatever reasons, don't make it through that process. But please find another way to kind of come and work for the government or work for Australia in whatever capacity you can, and give yourself the freedom to come back to these things later in life, because there's we do need Australians from all different experiences, from all different walks of life, from all different skill sets, from all different backgrounds, helping us being in the government and helping Australia on the world stage.
Thank you. Well, we've got time for one question from the floor here. And yes, okay, yes, we've got one from one of our students, yes. Speak up, Malcolm, so everyone at home can hear you.
Malcolm Nybor, University of Canberra runs. I was just wondering, firstly, very interesting ideas, thank you. I was just wondering, Southern Africa is an area that's fractured politically with wealth inequality. Obviously the health crisis of AIDS and HIV in the last 30, 40 years now has caused a bit of strife there. I was just wondering what you see that area coming out looking like in the next and in the future.
So that's a question about South Africa from
Southern Africa.
About Southern Africa from Malcolm from our international relations student body at the University of Canberra.
So look, I'd say one of my jobs before I went to Israel was I ran a sort of Africa branch for about 12 to 18 months, and it was my first time dealing with these issues. I'm kind of fundamentally an optimist about Africa, and I know it's wrong to sort of put the continent all together, the 54 countries and things like that. And yeah, there are some sort of places that are not doing so well that tend to get most of the media. I mean, South Africa and Zimbabwe in particular, and Southern Africa. But if you look at the continent on the whole, I think increasingly they're sort of economically integrated. They're doing more and more trade deals. They're lowering the boundaries between their countries. They're allowing more free movement of goods and people. Increasingly, they're attracting foreign investment. Increasingly, they're finding a role in global supply chains. They've got a huge, potential demographic bulge that's coming through, which is an opportunity. Often countries sort of industrialise or modernise off the back of that. And they're kind of like one of the last frontiers for development, which means they've got there's a huge amount to catch up, which means they're an attractive place to do business and invest. And they've also got the advantage they can, leapfrog in technologies, which they're already obviously doing. I mean, there's not a lot of, like telecommunications is all digitally and through satellite in Africa. So I think, generally speaking, the continent is much better governed than it was, 30 or 40 years ago. Generally speaking, the incidence of civil wars is much less. You don't get coups nearly as frequently. I think it's still got some way to go, but I think basically the broad trajectory is positive. And I was always an enthusiast for Australia doing more. I'm probably an enthusiast for Australia doing more everywhere because I sort of believe in Australia engaging in the world. But I always thought there were more opportunities to be had. They're obviously in multilateral institutions. They're a huge. They don't vote as a bloc, but they're a huge potential bloc of votes almost. Somewhere between a third and a quarter of kind of UN member states are members of the African Union. So it's important for those reasons as well. But I think I'm generally an optimist about Africa.
Dave, thank you so much.
Should we take the last question?
We've got one. We do have one question hiding away over there. All right, very quickly.
You flagged in that beautiful speech that some people believe we need to manage certain industries ourselves in case of global emergencies such as the COVID pandemic. Just your interest and stuff as well. I'm Ash Barnum. I'm with Piranhas at the University of Canberra, obviously New South Wales national member. Just wondering if you believe that there's a need to return to manufacturing in Australia, and if the government would be doing that in the future.
Yeah. So look, I think coming out of this crisis, I think we need to make sure that we can survive supply chain disruptions, right, as a nation. So part of that is like energy and fuel stockpiles in a simple sense. Australia's kind of runs pretty lean when it comes to, basically liquid fuels that keep the country running. So we are addressing that. I think pharmaceuticals is another area where the world noticed early on that, about 90% of pharmaceuticals come from one particular region in China. If for whatever reason that's disrupted or goes offline, the world cannot get pharmaceuticals. I think that's another area where we need to look at more resilience. But the answer to sort of more resilience is not always going to be we need to do more in Australia. Sometimes it's going to be you've just got a diversity of suppliers. You've got a few manufacturers you take from. Sometimes it might mean you just get more inventories in Australia. In Australia, we keep a medical strategic stockpile, if you like. And I think on manufacturing, I'm sort of attracted to the idea, but I think we just need to be careful because there's some people when they say that, they mean we need to start building Holdens again and making refrigerators and television and stuff. Australia is not going to be competitive in doing that. We're too small a market. We're too far away from it. Other markets, transport costs are too burdensome for kind of high, big, large volume goods and things like that. So we need to focus on where we have a competitive advantage, and that's going to be not in high labour, low capital, commodified manufacturing where we're never going to be able to compete on price. It's going to be in sort of high capital, skilled labour, niche kind of bespoke manufacturing, and as much. I mean, it's going to, and that's going to blur into sort of technology industries where basically what we're producing is data or platforms or software, not so necessarily physical goods. But that is a space that I think Australia needs to do a whole lot better in, because if you look at what are the drivers of wealth and prosperity and jobs today, it's big technology companies, right? People can rail against the monopolistic power and things like that. But I mean, the biggest, 5 of the largest companies in the US stock exchanges and the Dow Jones are technology companies. It's still Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Netflix and Alphabet, Google's owner. And, in China, you've got, big tech conglomerates in Japan as well. And if you look at Australia, I mean, we've still got quite a traditional industrial structure here. If you look at our ASX 20, banks, resource companies, a couple of telcos, insurance companies, probably the only thing that qualifies as a technology company, you can say Telstra does maybe, is CSL, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, which is obviously involved in this hunt for a vaccine. But if we want to remain an economy that pays high wages, that has a generous social safety net, that uses a skilled workforce, well, then we need to be having jobs in industries that are kind of at the edge of that value chain. And those are going to be things like advanced manufacturing. They're going to be, digital, innovative and kind of digitally oriented kind of virtual companies that produce virtual products or electronic products rather than physical products. I think we're doing a lot better than that than we were a few years ago. And I think, to be honest, the end of the resources boom has helped that, because that did actually suck up a whole lot of capital and workers and kind of opportunity. And now we're reverting to a kind of a more normalised role for resources in our economy. But I think it's something we do need to encourage. I think advanced manufacturing is definitely something the government's encouraging, and sort of digital kind of advanced technologies and innovation businesses more generally is also something we're doing a lot on.
All right. Thanks so much, Dave. It's been a tour de force, but time has escaped us. I'd also like to thank you in particular for having to, or being able to extricate yourself from Parliament this evening and driving himself here to be with us, which may not be quite Sydney traffic, but we do appreciate you coming. And on behalf of the branch, I'd like to express our thanks for your presentation today. You can come back on another occasion.
I'd love to come back again. So thank you so much for having me this evening. I appreciated our conversation and our discussion.
Before we cut the line, I should say that our next event, which is an online-only event, is on the 22nd of September. We have Peter Rogers, former ambassador to Israel as well, actually, talking about Israel and Australia's policies with respect to Israel and Palestine. So we invite you to tune in on that. But for this evening, thank you very much and good evening.